So, Franz, Alan, question to get us started today. If you could have any superpower, what would it be? Alan.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is flying.
Expand on it. Why flying? I mean, beyond the obvious, it would be sick.
Is it flying for commute or flying for pleasure?
Both, Franz, both. I mean, where should I start? Like, I hate traffic. That's one thing. Second, I mean, it would just be amazing to get somewhere super fast. Third, like, you could just lift up and just like observe things differently. It would give you literally a different perspective on life. So I think these three are top three reasons.
Some very good reasons. Franz,
Yeah.
if you could have any superpower and not flying, what would it
I
be?
mean, that was that's where my question actually came from, because mine would be teleportation.
Ooh,
But this is
okay.
more like, well, if you fly, then this is more for pleasure, right? There would also be an upside in being able to fly, would be nice. But teleportation has the commute without the fly, so it's just like, yeah.
Straight there. Bosh.
And
very
I talk
efficient.
about this, apparently, actually, I think about this a lot. I even have made up some rules together with my girlfriend on teleportation, because it can also get
Okay.
boring. Like, it doesn't mean anything anymore to be in a certain place if teleportation was free and readily available. So there's all these
Right.
rules around the world of teleportation. If you want to learn more about that, DM me.
Okay. Well, no, I think give us the short. Give us one of the rules at least. What's
Yeah.
the main rule? People want to know.
2 per month, max.
2 per month.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's still a scarce resource.
Yeah.
You can basically save them up, and miners are free. You can always
I
save
hope you're
them.
not gonna. That's your travel policy. I do love how organised this all sounds, Franz. I hate to lean on cultural stereotypes, but it's very efficient form of travel, and there are rules. So yeah, excellent stuff.
What about you, Tom?
Well, I mean, I guess flying was mine. The one that I really wanted to go for. I think I would go with time travel, which, in the same kind of sphere, I guess, particularly the teleportation. I watched the film Tenet last week, and it blew my tiny little mind. But it really got me thinking about how nuts kind of the concepts of time travel and the effect you could have, and the consequences of being able to do that are. And what would I do to try and change the course of time? Probably nothing terribly interesting.
So
I'd
going
try
back or
to
going
maybe-
forward, where would you go?
I'd go forward. Sounds terrifying, so I think I would avoid that. I think I'd go back to some iconic periods and try and not mess with anything too much, having watched Tenet. So, and Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey or Excellent Adventure, whichever one it is, which is more on my level than Tenet, to be fair.
But I think in this episode we're gonna do a little bit of time traveling.
We are. Thanks for bringing us
Bring
back
back
on
to
point. Bringing us back on point.
1939, I think so. Something like that.
1939, very good.
Yeah.
So you might be wondering why we're talking about superpowers. It's because today is all about superheroes, and a real superhero of the cinematic entertainment world, which is Marvel. So yeah, we are going to be diving deep, tearing down, as we always do, bit of the background, the strategy, the threats, opportunities of Marvel. And I would say, more specifically, I think it's fair to say, Alan and Franz, that this is more a focus on the Marvel Cinematic Universe rather than the comic books. They are obviously part of the story that we will touch on, but really where it's become such a compelling and interesting business case and has kind of seemingly taken over the world of entertainment is through cinema and television. So that is going to be our main focus for today.
I would also pack a little bit of comic stuff in there and company history before that, but yeah, gets really interesting. Around
where it gets juicy is Iron Man
1990s.
onwards, right?
Yeah, and also what led them to do that.
Yeah, also
Yeah.
numbers wise.
I think even the years before that are super, super interesting. So that's where I'm gonna Also, not only
Franz.
focus
Well,
on, but
I
also...
look forward to getting to that, definitely, because I preferred some of the older Marvel films, but I'll come on to that, my preferences, a little later. So if you've been under a rock for, I don't know, since the 1930s, then you've definitely heard of some of the Marvel world superheroes. Now, I'm going to caveat this whole episode with I'm not a Marvel person, and I'm really sorry if I get some of this wrong or upset the Marvel stands. I'm really worried that I'm going to drop in some characters that are like DC or something else. But the heavy hitters: Spider-Man, Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Black Panther. You've probably heard of a whole bunch of those. There's a ton more which have been explored in enormous detail in the cinematic universe, and these have been around now for so long, since the mid 20th century, and it seems crazy to me that they're still compelling and entertaining all these years on. You think about entertainment from that era, it doesn't tend to translate quite so well in the 2020s as it might have nearly 100 years ago, but they've been reinvented and those stories still hold true. So these characters started on paper, comic books, and that was where they lived and thrived for a very long time. But and their potential in film was untapped for such a long time, right?
Yeah, and
Franz,
I think also the biggest ones are, let's say, the first superhero movies. I don't know how pleasant they are to watch, to be honest. I'm going to touch on this too. I think superhero movies only became enjoyable with a certain tech in place.
Yeah.
So
some of the initial...
Sorry, go on.
Some of the initial early interpretations on film do not stand up well. You're absolutely right, Franz. The technology wasn't there to really bring them to life in the most compelling way. But you're gonna touch on that, I think, in a lot more detail later about what an important investment and technology move that was. So yeah, these characters remain popular on paper for decades, but really it was, Franz seems to think 90s onwards. In my head, it was like Iron Man onwards. The rest is sort of cinematic history from that period onwards. And this would turn out to be the kind of genesis period of what's an incredible creative business empire. And it's that creative element as well that I think makes it particularly fascinating from a sort of design and tech perspective, which we will get into. And like we said, that's really the focus today. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, or MCU, as people like to call it. And I think just to save ourselves a bit of time today, we'll probably use MCU a bit more regularly. And that's become a popular term for fans to use to describe the films, the universe. And we'll dive into this because that strategy to develop this sort of overarching narrative, including characters from across the Marvel world, throughout all the films, throughout all these phases, really became a sort of strategic masterstroke that we're going to dive into. And that was in the plan, and that plan has been executed pretty well. So the MCU, over the subsequent years, from the kind of establishment of what we see today as the Marvel Studios, has transformed into this sort of blueprint for branding, marketing, and franchise building in the entertainment industry. I don't think there's anything that quite compares with its scale and reach. But before we get into that, I've already asked you what your favourite superpower would be. Any favourite superheroes? And I'm going to go to Franz first on this one.
I am also not a too big aficionado of superheroes, but I just have to say that I love Deadpool.
Deadpool? That's a Marvel one, right?
Yeah.
I know it is. I'm only joking. What did you like about Deadpool? I've got to say, it didn't land with me.
The imperfection of this person. Being a hero, but also not being a hero at all. And I think they did it with Deadpool to the max, right? So that's also one decision that made Marvel super successful. Creating these characters that are not superheroes in the traditional sense, like Superman, this heroic, perfect man with superpowers, doing only good for the world, but actually creating characters that have flaws, that are weirdos, that are arguing. And I think they basically brought this concept to an extreme with Deadpool being basically more a villain than a hero almost, but still being the hero. So this is why I liked it.
You're absolutely right, Franz. Yeah, those imperfect, those flawed characters is where they started to really resonate with people with Fantastic Four, which I'll touch on in a bit. But yeah, so Deadpool for Franz. Alen, any favourites? Have you got like a Superman top underneath there that you're gonna?
No.
No. Okay, spared us that.
No. I mean, I think my favorite superhero, many people don't even consider a superhero, like Neo from The Matrix.
Oh, okay.
I would go with,
Right, yeah, that does feel a bit
I've
left
always
field.
been more towards like the, let's call it realistic superheroes.
Yeah.
And less I mean, both are not realistic, obviously, but just like the way Matrix is done, it just speaks a little bit more to my taste of action / superhero movies. But if I would have to like choose from the Marvel universe, probably the only one that I even like have watched is like Spider-Man. So then I would go with Spider-Man. But yeah, Neo is my choice.
Neo, never, I guess this is showing my naivety in that world. I'm not imaginative enough. But yeah, hadn't really considered him a superhero, but you're right. And that is a film I need to rewatch soon.
I know Kung Fu. It's like that moment got me.
Oh man, yeah, I remember seeing that in cinema when I was like 17, 16 and just being
just
like
blew my
blown
mind.
away. So good. I'm the same. I think it all sounds like we're not big superhero movie guys, which is going to make for an interesting objective conversation today. For me,
If you came
it's
here
a
for,
DC
like,
one.
If you, I just, oh sorry, you were just sharing your favorite superhero.
I was, but you go, Franz. I'll come back to me.
No, I just wanted to say that I know that they're like, this is an industry with super fans, right? So you have people who collect, who cosplay, who are like super bought into this. Pretty much like maybe sports. You could compare it from a level of people being into this topic. So if you came here to listen to, let's say, nuanced discussions about superhero characters, then that's going to be disappointing. That's going to be disappointing other 1 hour and something. But if you're here to think about how business of Marvel actually looks like, then you came to the right place. That's what we're going to do.
And that's what I find interesting about this. Like, we chose this topic knowingly that none of us is like a huge, not fan, but like we're not into it as deeply as some other people are, but we are super interested in like the business side of it. And there is a lot to uncover. Really interesting from the business perspective.
Big time. Yeah. And I don't know what your research, there's a lot of podcasts and videos out there if you want to go nerdy on Marvel. So fill your boots. But yeah, today we're going on the business side. I'm again not a big superhero person, but Batman for me, obviously in a different universe. That's so cliche, isn't it? It's like if you don't really like superhero films, it tends to be Batman. I don't know, something about the more realistic bits, like you said, Alen, he doesn't feel supernatural. He's a bit dark and moody. I kind of like that. Of the Marvel films I have seen, I really enjoyed Guardians of the Galaxy, probably because of the humour and the silliness and the soundtrack. But I feel like that's a very cliche answer that people who don't really like Marvel give. Batman and Guardians. So,
yeah, we gave the boring answers.
Yeah. So, but where did it all come from? So we're going to go back in time, and I want you to both imagine yourselves in 1930s New York. And the 1930s New York is quite a contrast between sort of resilience and struggle. Like, the Great Depression is still sort of casting a shadow, but as always in New York City, there's optimism. Skyscrapers popping up everywhere, piercing the horizon. The streets are sounding of honking of Model T Fords. Are you there, chaps? Can you, imagine yourselves? Because we're about to go up to the offices of 330 West 42nd Street. And that is where the origin of what would become Marvel started in 1939 by a chap called Martin Goodman. as Timely Comics. Now, Martin Goodman had already started to build a bit of a publishing empire. He was in the sort of pulp fiction business, and I don't know if either of you familiar with kind of what that means.
I'm
familiar with the movie.
We're familiar with the movie. It was these comics, these kind of stories that were printed on really cheap paper, which is kind of the pulp element of it. And it was these kind of bit of romance, bit of action. There was illustration in there, but they were very cheap, kind of throwaway publications. And he had built something of a reputation and business in that area. And he had started to expand that, and in 1939 would start what would become Marvel Comics, and he actually released an issue called the Marvel Comics. And at the same time as this was being launched, he had taken on an employee that you may have heard of, known as Stanley Lieber, but you probably know him by another name. Either of you hazard a guess who that might be? Stan Lee, who even myself as a not much of a comic book guy knows, the kind of legend, the guy that invented these characters that have become so enormous and actually ended up cameoing in most of the movies as well.
And he was office assistant, right?
He was, Franz. Yeah. What a story of like starting at the bottom, you know? So like Martin said to him, Stanley, welcome to Timely, but you're starting with the basics. Fill these inkwells, assist the artists, learn the ropes. He did not come in as this like creative director, creative genius. He was a runner and kind of admin and doing all the kind of shitty jobs to keep things going. No doubt an interesting place to be, but a long way from where he ended up being. So 1940s kind of kicks in, and Stan is starting to get a bit more influence in this very small company, and had started to kind of put his mark on some of the characters, like Captain America. He felt like that needed a kind of refreshing up. So he thought to himself, what if Captain America could kind of impose himself on what was happening in the war at the time? And he sort of gave him this signature shield that would help him, you know, fight the Nazis and stuff like that. And he started to just introduce these little extra elements, bring it into kind of what was going on in the world at the time, make it a little more relatable. And his influence in these areas would kind of slowly grow over time. His influence just continued to grow and grow. So there came a point in the late 40s where Martin Goodman was like, superheroes are not so much the thing at the moment. We need to sort of diversify. Can you help us adapt? And although maybe it wasn't the direction that he absolutely wanted to go in, Stan Lee was one of these people who absolutely believed in the leader and believed in adapting. And so went through this process of kind of diversifying a little bit into like romance and western and horror and stuff like that. Because he had this ethos, Stan Lee, of storytelling is storytelling. If you can do it well, you can do it across genres. But ultimately, they would return to superheroes. And this is where Stan Lee had his big breakthrough that we've already touched on. Their rivals, DC, had real success with the Justice League, with this kind of group of superheroes. And Stan was thinking, what if our heroes were like that? We needed something new to rival the Justice League, but what if they were different? Not these gods, but they were flawed, and it was about the people. And you've already talked about this, Franz. Marvel kind of really started to kick on in 1964 with the release of the Fantastic Four. These relatable, imperfect characters that just kind of really transformed their fortunes. So fast forward to the kind of late 60s, and Stan says to Jack Kirby, Jack, I've got this idea. It's this sort of teen superhero with no sidekick, which was unusual, but he's got real problems. He's a kid. He's kind of had this superpower thrust upon him. We'll call him Spider-Man. And they really made this story about just as much about the man as the kind of spider within it. And that really connected with not just kind of comic book fans for a long time, but with a younger audience as well, who kind of see themselves in Peter Parker. So, a real plotted story there. But Stan Lee was still not having that enormous. He was starting to have increased influence, but it was only really when an artist called Jack Kirby came in that the dream team came together. And for me, they feel a little bit like the sort of Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive sort of combination, this sort of visionary person in Stan with the creative ideas and everything. But then the man that can kind of bring it to life has the artistic talent, the creative talent. And that combination ended up being just completely formidable. But it was still relatively small. But ultimately, they would prove their worth. The Fantastic Four did really well. And the Marvel board in 1972 said, Stan, we need you at the top. You've proven yourself, your vision, your voice. They've defined us. How do you fancy taking the reins? So he would ultimately become publisher and editorial director. And he was like, if it's good for Marvel, I'm in. What an absolute servant of the organization. So, this was a decades-long story, but quite an inspiring one that I was not familiar with. I thought Stan Lee was this kind of guy who came in and was just making these characters up from day one and was kind of brought in to do that, but no, from the bottom to the top.
A superhero story in itself, from a runner to the CEO. Was he a CEO, did you say? Or
no, he came like the editorial director. He wasn't CEO, right. But certainly from where he was, filling up in inkwells and probably running out to get people packets of cigarettes and stuff. Quite a rise, but a rise that took time. But he trusted his leadership. He believed in the vision of the company, and thankfully he did, because they would not be the organization they are now without that.
And one of the reoccurring themes in like these stories is our superheroes in these stories always find a way to find an interesting Zack. So everybody else is zigging, and then they find a way to Zack. And in this case, it was like realizing that superheroes can be flawed, should be more human. So it's easier to relate to them. And it sounds, again, like such a small Zack, but it's huge. It has like a knockoff effect on basically how you draw, how you build a character, how you sell the merchandise and everything in between.
Totally. And I've no doubt we're going to get into that strategic decision. It wasn't really a strategic decision. It was a storytelling decision that turned out to be a really canny strategic move, which I'm sure we will get into the detail of. But, fast forward to the early 2000s, Marvel was struggling. We will get into that in a bit. That's where we'll pick up the story again soon. But first, I want to kind of go, why designers? Why might designers find this story quite compelling? Find Marvel an interesting case study, and very often it's completely clear. It's like there's something around brand quality or brand execution, all that kind of stuff. I think it's slightly more niche with this one. I think designers, like anyone, can just enjoy the great storytelling and the great creativity. But I think there are a few elements to how the MCU has sort of executed its strategy and brought these films to life that I think are worth kind of pulling out. First of those is the sort of visual design, the aesthetics. It's just incredibly unified, and when they land on a creative direction, the execution is just unreal. So each film has its kind of unique visual language. If you compare like Wakanda, which is this sort of futuristic area in Black Panther, to the sort of retro look of Captain America, it's done in such a coherent sort of together polished way that is really spot on. You don't see that attention to detail terribly often, and that leads me into this sort of brand consistency. Despite the fact that these span multiple films, directors and tones, there's a sort of consistent brand identity to the whole arc of these stories, and I think designers can appreciate the challenge of doing that, making each film feel distinct while still being part of the larger whole. I found that very challenging when I'm working on something like maybe a design system or say a brand that has multiple sub brands, and you want it to feel like they're all connected in some way, but they need that uniqueness. That is incredibly challenging. In digital, I can't imagine how you start to address that in film, and they have managed to do that, which is really inspiring. And then you have all the technology, the motion graphics and things like that, the set design. And the one that really got me when I was looking into this, and I was not aware of this, is the kind of color theory that Marvel bring to it. So many MCU movies employ very specific color palettes to convey mood and character and thematic elements. So, for example, the color green in Thor Ragnarok, is primarily associated with his character Loki, and contrasts really sharply with this kind of red film used for the primary antagonist. I think it's pronounced Hela. And having looked at a few clips, you see that they kind of really lean into that tone and color. And for many of us, we wouldn't even notice that. But when you realize the attention to detail and how that is really helping you understand the character, absolutely fascinating. I had no idea that was kind of part of how they thought about the design. And then, of course, there's a sort of collaborative creativity. I cannot imagine how you sort of get a team as vast array of artists, writers, directors, and designers to all kind of coalesce around a vision, around a project like that, and deliver it over such long time periods. And across films as well. It's completely inspiring to me. I just tip my hat to anyone who can kind of see that vision and execute it. So that's it for me. It's just a few reasons why, beyond the fact that these films are no doubt entertaining and the storytelling is fantastic, that there is this kind of next level of design sensibility that I think I hadn't appreciated until now.
As a part of my research, I also found I believe it was Harvard Business School video where they were researchers who analyzed exactly this thing. So how does Marvel succeed in making this thing look unified, even though it's always different? And they were basically talking about, they had this graph of how they are purposefully basically trying to break from something that's expected, and that's kind of the common thread in the Marvel movies, is this unexpected part to it. It's like breaking the norm, and that's a really thin line between breaking a norm and still being popular, because you can go too far with it. But they are really dancing on this edge nicely, always trying to find a way to make it slightly different. And I even learned that they use different directors for each movie, and usually these directors are not the most famous directors out there, but have a really specific taste, really specific look and feel. But somehow they still manage to incorporate these directors into the Marvel look and feel.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast where they're talking about I can't remember who it was with, but talking about bringing in Jon Favreau to direct Iron Man, and it would have been an easy decision to find a director who had done superhero films in the past, who had done action films, but they sort of knew, look, internally we kind of know how to do that. We understand we understand how to do action, we understand how to present our characters, we have the visual language and everything. We need a really good storyteller. We need someone with humor. We need someone who can be creative with budget as well, because it was quite low budget comparatively, that first one. So you're absolutely right, Franz. The story of how they've selected these directors. And then to my point about consistency, managed to have this kind of consistent delivery and way of doing things, even though directors have changed. I just find it fascinating and inspiring.
Cool. Way to go, yes. Right? From 1939 to cinematic universe right now. And well, Tom, you already gave us a little bit of an overview of how the company came to be. I will not tell you the same, but I will still start in the same year. I'll go back to the picture you painted from New York and talk again about Martin Goodman, who, as you said, created or founded Timely, the interesting thing here for me was that this person was a publisher. So he went into comic books because he thought this was a business completely without IP. So he didn't have a story, he didn't have comic book writers. He actually made a deal with a company called Funnies.inc. Funnily, it's called Funnies.inc. And this is basically a...
Very good.
It was a collective of comic writers. And they made a deal. They said, well, we have the IP, we have characters, we have stories, but we don't have distribution. Goodman, on the other hand, he has distribution, he's a publisher, but he needed the stories. So this is how this company came to be, that he actually founded Timely Productions, Timely Comics, with no production itself. Like, he didn't have production of content. He only had, he had the link to the market. He was the publisher. I want you to keep this in mind, because this is a recurring theme of what is the important thing in the industry. Is it IP or is it actually access to market and distribution? Because that's going to change throughout the story of Marvel several times, because sometimes they will have this and they will not have the other thing. Sometimes they will have, seems to have both, then they will maybe get a partner who has it better. So that's just a few spoilers of what's going to happen in the next few minutes, 10 minutes. Let's see how long it's going to take to walk you through some business decisions that they took. But yeah, let's keep an eye on IP versus distribution. That's going to be the recurring theme. Alrighty, so this is how it started, right? Timely production. Yes, the first comic was named Marvel Comic #1, but Marvel disappeared again as a brand name. The company was not called Timely. Also, the comics were not really named Marvel. It was more about the superheroes, and we already talked about this big market increase, the big success in the war era, where superheroes were just exactly what people needed. They created Captain America, actually one that was created then within the company. So that was the first one where they actually also had IP created within their own company. That was a huge success for them. Interestingly, because Captain America actually punched Adolf Hitler in the face even before the US joined the World War II. So you can see that these running gags of how the Simpsons would actually predict something that would happen in the future. So Marvel did this already in the 40s. So this is maybe the magic of animated stuff, that there are some creative minds behind that who think of what could happen, and sometimes they're actually right, and it seems like they're predicting the future. So yeah, IP creation was now integrated also in the company, and this worked quite well for a while. As you said, then after that, there was a little bit of a downturn in the 1950s. Superheroes weren't that important anymore in the post-war era. They went a little bit into different genres. They also had an interesting conflict with parents. So apparently, parents of the US have a pretty big lobby that is strong enough to almost censor comic books.
Yeah, basically ban. Yeah, almost.
So comic books were sold at groceries, which is where also parents would buy. So they weren't comic book stores back then. And they would actually go as far as saying, we will boycott any grocery store that would sell also comic books. It was so big, this issue was so big that even US Congress was discussing regulations on comic books.
Yeah. And the reason was that parents had a feeling that kids reading these comic books actually then became more aggressive. They basically the same like rationale and reasons you hear that parents dislike gaming today, like computer games.
Yeah.
So it's just comics was the first precursor of the gaming.
Yeah. The reason why I'm bringing this even up, apart from it being a nice story that parents rage out and then apparently, you even get the power of censorship. But what they did was, or what the whole comic book industry did, is that they created their own comics code authority. So instead of getting censored, they created their own comic code authority, which would basically approve certain stamps, approve certain standards, or that this comic book would meet certain standards, and then it would be accepted from these shops again. Yes, they basically saved their market, but at the same time, they also kind of destroyed their market, to be honest, because what became clear more and more is that comic books is not only something that children read. Comic books is something that adults loved, and they loved it exactly for their edgy content. And now that you had this comic code authority, which basically would have to water down stories, would have to make sure that language is actually, that they all watch the language, all these stories got banned, and sales took a big hit for the whole industry. So this is actually exactly when now Stan Lee enters the whole thing. I mean, we know that he entered the whole thing already in 1939 when he was the office assistant, but now he got in charge by the early 1960s. So 1961, we had this actual branding of Marvel. This was when they actually first decided to use the name Marvel, and that's also when Stan Lee really got into the creative lead of the company with, as you said, created Fantastic Four in 1961 together with Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. I think the second person created the X-Men, Iron Man, Thor, the Hulk, Black Widow, the Avengers, Silver Surfers, Doctor Strange. So now you can see that all of these characters, all of this IP was created in the 60s and in the 70s. So this was a powerhouse of storytelling and of creating of characters. And now you can see that, well, it seems like when you think of strategic activities, they went into over-investing, maybe, and we'll see later, went into over-investing into production and into R&D, but maybe not having as big of an eye with the on the distribution. But well, just in general, their business went well. They had these new characters. Their new characters were much more relatable. They were doing good on the market, and this is actually now it can be seen as the foundation of Marvel, of how it is today, right? This universe that they have created. And with this tailwind, the company went on expansion and diversification path. So this came hand in hand also with a change in ownership. 1989, billionaire Ronald Perlman took over the company, and notably, and maybe take a note of that, he bought it for $82 million. And officially created the Marvel Entertainment Group. And there is a very famous quote of him saying, "Marvel is a mini Disney in terms of intellectual property. Disney has got much more highly recognized characters and softer characters, whereas our characters are termed as action heroes. But at Marvel, we are now in the business of creating and marketing these characters."
No spoilers, but yeah, that would end up being an interesting one to reflect on.
No
what year
spoilers,
was that,
but
Franz?
yes,
so
spoilers.
82 million.
82 million in 1989.
1989. Okay. And was that 100% of the company, or?
I think so, yeah, because Goodman actually sold the whole company to another company who only held the company for 2 years, I think. So I didn't want to go into the nitty-gritty details of that, but the most notably change actually came with the acquisition by Ronald Perlman, who was now more focusing on distribution again. Now we have almost like 1.5 decades of production and distribution like it was through comic books. And now we're actually going into more of a era of distribution again. So with this quote of saying, well, we're in the business of creation, and I am pretty sure what he meant was marketing of characters. So he did say creation and marketing characters, but he was actually really focusing on marketing these characters. There was a big diversification going on. So in the early 90s, Marvel acquired other businesses and entered various licensing agreements. So they went into merchandising, they went into toys, they bought a minority stake of a company called Toy Biz, and they also, part of this deal was a licensing agreement for toys. So Toy Biz would actually create action figures from their characters, and at the same time they would buy 46% of their company, and they even diversified horizontally, which was done by buying a company that was in the business of baseball cards, Fleer. So they bought another similar company, right? It's kind of in the realm. It's different, yes, but it's kind of a similar thing. It's a company that creates and produces sports cards that can be traded and were a huge collectible thing at this point in time. Is anybody of you a collector? Like, have you ever collected
cards?
Anything?
Anything or baseball cards?
Baseball cards. I don't know. Did you do stickers for FIFA World Cup?
Yeah.
Did you
Panini stickers?
Panini stickers, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I still have 2002 World Cup Panini album filled up.
Yeah.
What's the right word, Tom?
Yeah, filled up. Yeah, if you did you have to get on the black market to get some final stickers, or did you just get lucky?
What do you mean black market? So we had this, like, in school you could just swap.
Right.
Is that what you mean? Or
yeah, no. I mean, like, did you have to, go and acquire your final cards somewhere else?
No. I was like this age. I had no money, so we would basically just swapping with other kids.
Yeah.
And then at a certain point, you would fill it, complete it, hopefully.
For me it was like football cards, and like we had this thing in the UK where at the World Cup they do these football coins, and you would get them at the petrol station. You'd go and push them in. I come from a family of collectors, and I have sort of pushed back on it, to be honest. I haven't got the space or the time for having shit cluttering up my house. So no.
So follow-up question. You know that you can collect stuff for the pleasure of having it, but there is also collectors who do this for investment purposes, right? So buying sneakers for thousands of euros, that like collect them in a sense of, I think it's not pure investment. You need to be bought into this. There's always like a mix of emotional and financial interest in there. Did anybody go into that?
Yeah. I think once you start seeing something more as an asset, though, I don't know. I feel like maybe you're losing the heart of what collecting is about. As someone who doesn't collect shit, I don't know, I have this purist image of like people, I don't know. But yeah, the sneaker collecting bit, actually, that's probably the closest I've come to thinking, I might covet, a few like nice sneakers, but they take up too much space, Franz, and the market is wild. But yeah, you're right. That seems to be the most contemporary one, right? That had a real boom recently. And I think New Balance recently did like an X-Men collaboration release, which is hideous.
I mean, we did have a collectible market that was quite big a year ago.
Don't talk about NFTs, man.
Next topic, Franz.
Okay. So, you know why I'm even bringing this up, right? Do you know why I'm bringing it up? No, you don't.
No, I don't think I do. I mean, I can sort of see where you might go, but...
Apparently, and I was new to this as well, there was a comic book bubble. And there was a baseball card bubble.
Yes.
And
heard about the baseball card one.
Was a huge reason for Marvel to go bankrupt. And I was like, no way, you can't tell me that. I mean, yes, a housing bubble, I get that. I've heard about this. And yes, I've heard about people losing all their money or a lot of their money with NFTs. But comic book bubble, seriously? So I read up about it, and it's actually works exactly like any other bubble. And that's what actually happened.
But tell me, Franz, like, how doesn't a company that rides on the wave of the bubble profit from it? How did it go bankrupt?
They did profit on it immensely. Like, people would, in this era, in the 19th, go crazy about comic books. There would be comic book stores popping up. You would have, like, comic books, especially in the US, were crazy in the 90s. It got even so crazy that people were not only collecting them, but actually trading them. So there were issues sold for thousands of dollars. Well, this is obviously great for Marvel, but
Exactly.
if you are Marvel, you have the power to burst that bubble, which is exactly what happened. So there was a new issue of a comic book. Everybody thought like this is going to be the next big shit that will be worth a few thousand of dollars. Marvel would produce a lot of them. People would not buy one, but maybe two or three of them because they thought they would be so valuable in the future. Yeah. Until everybody realized that everybody would have bought 2 or 3 copies of that. So it's not worth anything anymore. And that was actually, it sounds silly. Like when I explain it, it feels weird explaining it. But apparently what happened is, and please correct me if I understood this wrong, apparently what happened is that this was a bubble that burst. So all of a sudden, people were like, well, if this is not worth anything, what if my whole collection isn't worth anything? Nobody would trade anymore. Nobody would buy anything for $1,000 anymore. But the collectors would have already spent a few $1,000 in their collection. So all of a sudden, sales of comic books would drop completely. So nobody would buy comic books anymore. And the growth was actually fueled by people buying not one comic book to read, but actually buying 3 comic books to keep them in an original packaging. And all of a sudden, this whole spiel is gone, which means you're not selling any comic books anymore because you inflated the market before and you planned with these figures, and all of a sudden it's back to reality. The bubble burst, and your sales actually completely crash. And
that does sound familiar.
Yeah. So inflated prices, inflated demand, and then a bubble burst. And the other thing was a little bit more, let's say, unfortunate and coincidental for them, because there was also very big. So the market for collectibles was also very big for baseball cards, and the Major League Baseball actually went on a strike on that year. And again, I don't know anything about baseball, and I don't know anything about this strike. I listened to some of the podcasts, and people were describing this. Hey, yeah, I remember this when I was small. There was this strike. So excuse me if I don't know anything about this. I just know that this strike of the Major League Baseball also contributed towards to the baseball collectibles, baseball cards bubble to burst. And now imagine this. You as a company, you have taken on a lot of debt because what you thought was now I have all these characters. I want to monetize this now. I want to focus on the distribution. So let me go into a licensing agreement with this company. Let me buy that company. Let me invest here. So let me just take on debt because that's going to only be an upwards market. So you have all these debt, and all of a sudden it's not an upwards market anymore, but there are 2 bubbles in 2 of your biggest markets that actually burst. And all of a sudden your sales plummet. And that's exactly what happens. And that's exactly what led to the bankruptcy of Marvel. So it was so close to us not even having Marvel Cinematic Universe at all.
It didn't go fully bankrupt, right? They filed for bankruptcy, but then they got saved, right?
Exactly. And you know by whom they got saved?
Yeah, the very company they bought.
Exactly. Toy Biz.
Yeah, Toy Biz. So it's like, no, I'm your father. No, you're my father. Yeah, that was funny when I read that.
Exactly, yeah. They didn't go bankrupt. They filed for bankruptcy. Then they had another like dead shark trying to take them over. Not going to go into that, but all of a sudden, or eventually, Toy Biz, the company that they had bought a few years back, 46%, I believe, and did the licensing deal on toys, they would actually come back and buy Marvel and would then combine the two businesses and only have a Marvel company being merch, Marvel company being toys, and the Marvel company being studio.
That's the new thing, right?
This Marvel company of studio is not the new thing. Because first, they didn't actually think about making movies. First, they thought about staying alive. They actually really had to stay alive. So what's the easiest way to monetize IP?
To license it?
Exactly. So now we're back at this distribution versus IP. All of a sudden, so you started as only having distribution but no IP, working together with this Funnies Inc. to get the content. Now you all of a sudden have this repository of awesome characters, but you don't have any money to produce anything. Your market that you're active is completely dead. What are you going to do? I mean, yes, you can sell toys, but that's maybe not going to keep a whole company afloat. So what else are you going to do? Well, you take these characters, license them out for other movies, and that's exactly what happens. So the first movies that you saw with Marvel characters, Spider-Man, X-Men, Hulk, there was not Marvel movies. Those were movies that were created by Sony, by Fox, by Universal. And maybe I'm wrong here, I think that even Men in Black was licensed from Marvel. So the first movies, they were kind of successes, but they were not done by Marvel. This was basically their first attempt at building a new company in an era where your old distribution channel, being comics, wouldn't work anymore.
Read into this what you will, but the only film I've ever fallen asleep in the cinema to was X-Men 2, when it was a Sony one. Didn't do it for me. Needed that sweet Marvel studio touch.
You know what was shocking to me when I looked into those deals? So as far as I understand, these deals are like licensing in perpetuity, which means like these studios, Sony and so on, they hold like license for, as you mentioned, Spider-Man and the rest, like almost forever, you know?
Yeah. That was necessary for them. And the business model and strategy behind this is, well, I have merch and I have the rights to that. And I have toys and I have the rights to that. That only makes sense if I have somebody pushing this character into the world. Okay, so I cannot do this because I don't have a comic book market anymore. I cannot do this because, well, I don't actually know how to make movies, but what's the best way to push this out? Yeah, it's a movie. So you license this, you earn money from this license agreement, and then you hope to actually make the money then from merch and toys, which is the things that they still owned.
Exactly, yeah. But still, I was like surprised because you do this deal, and that's why Marvel can never do a Spider-Man movie. I mean, they could renegotiate maybe with Sony, but it's basically Sony's now owning in a way, or has a license for the Spider-Man movie. So that's why you never. Also, when we're gonna get to the finances, that's why Spider-Man is not like a movie that goes under Marvel's or Disney's profit and loss statement. But more about it in a bit.
Yeah, but that's actually a really, really nice lead because, well, okay, you have now built a company that works like this, that you have IP over characters. You own fully by selling merch and selling toys, and you own licensing fees by creating movies. And then you have the situation that you see that some of these movies are very, very successful. And at the same time, you see that some of these movies are crap. So you're actually in a company that has a big heritage of creating these characters, and if it's done well, then another company makes the money, and you can feel like, you don't feel great about that. Or the other opportunity is, or the other option is that the company you license this product to actually doesn't do well. It's not going to be a good movie, and you feel like they have screwed around with the character and damaged a very nice character, because what you've done is you've licensed out the best of your best, right? You needed to stay afloat, so you took your top characters and licensed them to another company. And they're killing
So I
it.
have some stats on this that might be interesting to put into perspective. So merchandising is less than 10% of the how much a certain movie is grossing, which means that if you are now Marvel in this case, and you look at a movie potentially making 500 million, there's someone else is making much more, generating much more revenue than you are with your own IP.
Yeah. And that's exactly what Dave Meisel thought. So Dave Meisel back then was the president and COO of Marvel Studios. So just a reminder, Marvel Studios was not creating movies, but was licensing out characters to other movie studios. So Dave actually, he didn't like that. He was like, how can we leave all this money on the table on the one hand side? And he said, how can we let other studios destroy the awesome characters that we have? So what he actually wanted to do is he wanted to make their own movies. He wanted to create the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Two problems at this point of time. First problem is Marvel only had tier 2 characters left back then, because the top characters were already licensed out. So now Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, everything that we know now, it's now popular. But at this point in time, it was like, meh. It was a character in some comic from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So that wasn't too big, right? But still, it was there. There were still characters. And the second problem was there was no money. You just went out of bankruptcy, or from the brink of bankruptcy, and to keep yourself afloat, you sell toys and merch and license out the characters. So this company was really not doing well. So what actually Dave was doing is that he first tried to convince the board, and the board just said, well, Dave, there is no money. If you can find the money, you get the go. You can create an actual studio. So what Dave actually did is that he went to Merrill Lynch, a bank that would go bankrupt 2 years after the deal, but not because of this deal, but because of another financial crisis, another bubble that burst. So he approached Merrill Lynch and he said, look, let's do a deal. I have these characters and I want to create movies with these characters, and you can see that action hero movies are successful. Just look at Spider-Man, just look at these our characters where other companies made a lot of money with that. So I need money for 4 movies, and I would need about $535 million for that.
Please.
And please. And if that doesn't work, so if it works, you'll get your money back, obviously. So that was a loan. So you get your money back with interest. And if it doesn't work, you get the IP of these characters. So imagine the only thing that you have left as a company is IP. You don't really have anything left when it comes to distribution, because you have lost your distribution channels. Comics don't really work anymore. As you said, the revenue from merch and toys isn't as big. The only thing you have left is characters. Most of them, the best ones, you've already licensed out. So you have another few, and now you're willing to bet them into an all or nothing deal. Either you make it work with this studio, or you lose all of these characters. So you need to convince the board that this is a good idea. So maybe to the board, they've said, look, if we lose these 4 characters, that's fine. We have so many more. We have like 500 characters, and that's actually true. So at the point of acquisition, they had like 500 and something characters. So he would have to convince the board that these four characters aren't really important. But at the same time, he had to convince Merrill Lynch that these four characters are the ones that will actually bring back the money. And basically, the rest is history. They were actually able to close the deal. And he got the money. And what came out of this is Iron Man in 2008. Iron Man was the first in-house Marvel movie, which was based on a character, Iron Man, that was far less popular than Spider-Man or X-Men at the time. And the success didn't just prove that Dave's hypothesis was right, but it also marked like the start of this Marvel Cinematic Universe that turned Marvel from this underdog company that had like a weird list of characters into like the titan and the big player in the cinema world.
And just to provide some context, so it cost around $180 million to produce Iron Man, and it grossed almost $600 million. So yeah, it was a huge hit for Marvel.
So if we compare that to the 535 million that they got, this means that they were almost 2/3 that they already were able to pay back with the first movie.
It's a little bit more complicated, but I'll get to this in the financial part because there's some more costs involved in this. But let's say that they definitely made some profit on this one, which showed promise. But
nice one. Yeah, I mean, the story is almost over, but there is another era, right? So 2008 Iron Man movie. Now, all of a sudden, having both again. You have IP and great characters, and you have distribution. And now, all of a sudden, your merch, your toys, everything gets more valuable, right? You're basically just proving that superhero movies work, and you can actually have big business with these characters. And there was a big plan. There was a big plan of creating these four movies with the money from Merrill Lynch, but there was also this big plan of creating this, Marvel's cinematic universe where these characters would actually, from one and another comic, would interact with each other. So there was this huge plan of what Marvel could be in future. And that was actually also noticed by another big body in the industry, because in 2009, just 1 year later, after the first big success of their own film, Disney acquired Marvel for $4.2 billion. So what Disney is an even bigger publisher, if we just use the words again that we used in the last part of the in the first part of the podcast, right? So what Disney basically did is they would buy IP, because the only way that Disney could still grow, they already had the brand, they already had the distribution figured out, they knew how to make movies, so they had all of that figured out. What they didn't have is IP that would also grant them a new piece of the market. So when you think of the quote that, let me just look up his name, the Ronald Perlman, who in 1989 bought Marvel, he said, well, we have characters that are more in a superhero movie ballpark, and Disney is the company that has softer characters, and we are just the smaller version of Disney, also in a slightly different market when it comes to characters. But now they prove that they're actually a pretty big market when it comes to characters. They actually have a very big list of characters, and that's actually what Disney at this point in time didn't have, because Disney at this point in time still owned more of the softer characters, and they owned animation films over Pixar, but what they didn't have was this spectrum of superheroes, rough, edgy stuff, and that's what they now bought with Marvel. So in practice, what they did is, getting more IP to fuel their flywheel, to fuel their distribution channels. And that is almost the end of the story. We have seen a lot of more big successes like the Hulk and Thor and Captain America and the Avengers and Guardians of the Galaxy. But then lately, we have also seen movies that were not that well received by fans. So it seems that at first, Marvel's unique identity remained intact. And now people are more and more criticizing that it seems that they are prioritizing quantity over quality. Maybe there is an influence by Disney, the thing that you always discuss, right? When you have a takeover of a beloved company and brand from a much bigger player, you're always worried that this player will actually screw it up. So that's maybe what's happening now. Maybe we hear more about the recent financials from Alen. And I'm really curious about that. But just to sum this up, when it comes to strategic decisions, there are obviously some product strategy decisions that put Marvel ahead already when it comes back to like the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? So with most notably Stan Lee's new interpretation of what superheroes are, right? Having these flawed individuals, that's obviously a big strategic, a big product strategy decision, changing what a superhero actually is. Also pioneering this idea of this interconnected universe where all these characters would, from different comics, would actually be able to interact in another sequential of the comic with each other, which was also an idea that wasn't there before. But in my opinion, the biggest takeaways for me are timing and IP versus distribution. So I think timing was a huge thing here. If Marvel would have started with superhero movies a few years earlier, where there wasn't the opportunity of this tech that we currently have to create something that's truly unique and that's truly, let's say, also represents the quality of the character when it comes to bringing it to life, to execute it, I think it wouldn't have been such a success. They just, I don't know if they purposefully waited long enough, but it just, the timing that made it actually really, really successful. And that is more a passive thing, in my opinion, right? You either do something or not, but you maybe have the right timing. But what's really, really important here is this, let's say, balance of IP and distribution. And the shifts that this company underwent when it comes to first having only distribution but no IP, then over-focusing maybe on IP, then pushing maybe too hard with distribution and going bankrupt, almost going bankrupt, then all of a sudden figuring out both with movies and having great characters, and eventually being bought up by a distribution powerhouse of Disney. So that's, for me, a super interesting one to just see how this company found over and over again, found ways to capitalize on the IP and find new ways with merch and toys and licensing characters when they didn't have another opportunity, and then creating their own studio.
It's a story also of trying to find the best business model for your most important asset. So each company has a thing that makes them special, a capability, an asset. And I think here we see a company that has gone through many, many iterations of trying to find the best business model for its asset, which was in this case intellectual property of these characters. So as you said, they tried with comic books, which worked, but also wasn't like maybe what they were hoping for. Then they tried merchandise, and the movies was the big thing that they could still try. And we've seen also stories like other stories of companies also trying to find different business model. So the one that comes to mind like is Netflix. So they initially they were in the business of renting out DVDs. So that was their core capability. And they took this, reimagined it, tried to apply a different business model, a business model that's much more scalable. And ultimately they ended up with a different result. Also on the topic of distribution, Franz, so I think what's interesting is that the reason this made sense for Marvel and for Disney is because, Marvel did kind of find distribution channels by becoming a studio or studio basically, but Disney was just on another level. So they had distributions figured out for TV. So they basically own TV stations. They have ABC and ESPN. They also have now streaming, obviously, which is another distribution channel you can easily use to distribute the content. They have theme parks. That's also a big one. So, you have a kid who loves the Spider-Man, you can take them to the Disney World and they can see the Iron Man there.
Meet them.
The merchandise sales, I mean, obviously, Marvel had merchandise sales before, but Disney is just on another level, like globally representative. So it felt like at the time when Disney acquired Marvel, $4.2 billion was, most people said this is too much. That it was just like, there's no way this makes sense for Disney. But if you have this perspective in mind that, we're just going to use our own distribution and our own flywheel to generate even more value with this IP, it just made a lot of sense.
Yeah. And they just needed Marvel to prove that superhero is big box. Like that these kind of movies actually work, right? You had a few other hits and not so good hits from other studios like Universal and Fox and Sony, but Marvel actually showed that this is actually working. They have an engine to create these movies that actually draw people into cinemas. And just as a reminder again, superhero movies, they weren't a big thing. You had these weird Superman movies. I still remember watching them when I was small. So this weirdly animated, like you watch them, you're not really sure what you're watching. I didn't enjoy it. But then when I first watched a superhero movie with this new tech, I was like, okay, that works for me. I can watch all of a sudden superhero movies. Before I was like, categorically, no, I can't do this because that's weird. But with this new tech and with these new opportunities, all of a sudden you could watch them. Where like there was no cringe involved because everything was made just so well. And I think this tech made it attractive for the masses. And Marvel actually proved that. And then it was kind of a, I mean, in retrospect, every investment that worked out is a safe investment. But I see why they waited a little bit to see if the Marvel movies actually turned out to be a success and then actually bought it. So Disney.
Yeah, if you compare the old technology, you need to be able to suspend disbelief with something like a superhero film. And maybe at the time, the Christopher Reeve, like Superman films and that, people could to an extent, but it's night and day now. I mean, I don't find those old ones compelling for the same reasons. So it felt like it had to, that the timing element, like you say, was so critical. The bit that I most admire about the story is the trust in two people in particular, Stan Lee and David Meisel. I think both quite visionary and given an enormous amount of trust by the organisation at critical points in their journey. I don't think we would be discussing Marvel today if it weren't for those two people in particular. I think they had some sort of secret sauce and vision that's just been transformative. David Meisel is really fascinating. The fact that he was able to envisage this long arc with the MCU is quite inspiring. And finally, you touched on this a lot, Franz, the fact that they were limited with these characters and had to start off with Iron Man. What they were able to do under, I guess, creative limitations. I often think it can bring out the best in you as a designer is, okay, we haven't got the best character in the world. We haven't got the most well-known character in the world. We haven't got the best budget going. We've got time constrictions and things like that. To actually be able to craft something like Iron Man under those and make it a success really inspirational. Not working with always the, working with Spider-Man from the get-go with all the technology and all the budget to make it work. I was listening to an interview with him on Tim Ferriss where he was talking about, actually, if you watch Iron Man back, it's a long period in the film before you get into any of the really juicy CGI. And they had to get that storytelling really on point and then just use it at the right points. And I kind of think about design with that. It's like, where are you going to get the most bang for your buck with design? Think strategically about where it fits in the story of a product or a service. I just found that a really inspiring way, really inspiring story that they were able to kick off this incredible journey with those constraints and that character. It's made me want to go back and watch Iron Man as well.
Do you remember another company, product, that used the same playbook to this summer to reinvigorate their business and also brand? It was huge.
Or Marvel?
Feels like it one that we should know about.
Neither.
No, but
Give us a
playbook.
clue.
You said
Yeah. It's
Which
the same
playbook?
playbook used by another company. A business playbook
of Marvel or
having
business?
an IP. So it's a playbook of having an IP and using it to produce movie.
Ooh.
IP and using it to produce a movie.
Don't know.
Doesn't
Barbie.
ring a bell.
Oh, of course, Barbie. Yeah,
That's
Yeah.
true.
good shout.
1.4 billion in sales up until now. Pretty crazy. They did partner up with Warner Bros. But still, like, this is their attempt to also go from being just a toy to being more of a content company. But obviously, I had a look at some financials and numbers, and in this case, I wasn't really just looking at Marvel as such, but I was just interested to understand how movies generally work, what is the split of the revenue, and what makes a successful movie and not. So maybe let's start with just production and cost in general. So you have production costs and you have marketing costs. So on average, the Marvel movie costs somewhere between, so the production budget is between 150 to 300 million dollars. By the way, that's a huge number. I just can't believe that someone needs that much money to produce a movie. But at the same time, I understand why. There's a lot of work involved. Still, so it's between 150 to, let's say, 300 million in production costs. And then usually we can just say 1 times more. So basically double that to get a marketing cost. So if, I don't know, a movie costs 200 to produce, there's also 200 million in marketing costs. And generally, when you read this top line revenue for these movies, so these movies don't get to keep all of that money. So like when you sell, let's say, when you go and watch Avengers in the US cinema, 50% of that goes to the studio and 50% keeps the theater. I mean, this 50-60% varies depending on the location. It can be as low as 25% if you are showing this movie in China. But when you combine all of this together, there is this really interesting heuristic that people use in this industry to understand if a movie is profitable or not, which is, as a rule of thumb, the movie needs to make 2.5 times more than it costs to produce to break even. So when you have a look at the production costs, if you multiply this with 2.5, then you get the full number of how much this money needs to make, so this movie needs to make in order to break even. So if a movie costs $200 million to produce, it must generate $500 million in order to break even.
In box
So,
office
do you
sales
wanna know
or
how
in revenue
many-
for the studio?
In the revenue for the, so this is the gross, it's take the gross revenue because it oversimplifies things on both sides. So it just looks at the gross revenue of the of the sales of the tickets.
Okay.
So there's certain things that are not involved in on the cost side and on the revenue side. That's why it just actually evens out on 2.5. So do you want to know how many of Marvel movies since 2008 actually crossed the 2.5 multiple of the production budget? So up
Let's
until
start with how
2023.
many are there?
Too many.
So in my spreadsheet, I have, well, give me a second, 32.
32.
Yeah, I have 32 movies in this spreadsheet, just that I'm looking at right now.
Surely not some of the. I mean,
Like, are these
yeah.
all?
Go on then, Alan. Put
Yeah.
us out of our misery.
So out of 32, 28
It's pretty
basically
good.
passed the threshold of 2.5 multiple of revenue compared to the production cost. So this is 88%.
Break even.
Which is-
that.
What's break even?
So here we are talking about break even. That doesn't mean, like, even if we have 28 of these just breaking even, it's still not a good business, but it's a good business. What you're saying is that they didn't make losses with 28 of these. With 4 of them, they did make
They made
losses.
profit with 28 of these.
2.5,
Yeah.
right?
So 28
Yeah.
out of 32 were profitable, and only 4 were not profitable. And
Okay.
in a business that's driven by hits, that is a huge number.
Yeah.
And I'd imagine the profit from the others evens out, eclipses any losses on those 4 duds along the way.
Yeah.
I reckon I
so-
could probably guess what a few of those duds might have been.
Oh,
actually.
go ahead. Go ahead, Tom.
I'm going to say Doctor Strange, maybe.
Which one? No.
No. And this is coming from someone who knows next to nothing. I'm just basing it on like the ones that sort of got in my psyche as people moaning at me for not having seen.
Yeah.
Ant-Man?
Yeah.
That
Ant-Man.
Not
Eternals.
profitable.
Eternals.
Were not profitable.
Right.
You're losing us, Franz. So Tom was
No, I'm
Tom was
here.
guessing the 4 that were not profitable.
Yeah.
So one is the Ant-Man, Eternals, Black Widow, and Incredible Hulk.
Really? The Incredible Hulk?
Yep.
Would have thought he would...
I mean, this is based on this very simple
multiples.
heuristic of
Yeah,
2.5 KPI. So obviously we don't have all the financials, and maybe even out there we can find some more exact data points. But the purpose of this exercise for me was to learn how to quickly judge what a good movie looks like in terms of the money, and the second is just to see if on average Marvel was above average here, and definitely this looks super good. And I mean, all of these movies together from 2008 to 2023 grossed $29 billion in sales. So if we go back to the Disney's $4 billion investment back in 2008, I think it's pretty clear that Disney has made a pretty good choice, basically, with this investment, even though it was heavily criticized at the time.
And that's without all the streaming stuff that I don't know whether you're going to touch on as well. But yeah, pretty healthy.
Yep. So approximately 11 billion of profits comes like from Marvel during this time. So that's basically my biggest story in terms of the numbers. One other thing I was interested to understand was what is usually the split of the revenue. What's usually the split of the revenue for a movie? So how much, what percentage comes from the ticket sales, and what percentage comes from other things? So 40% is theaters, and then 35% right now is streaming, 15% TV, and then the rest is other things like merchandising and the rest. So
I thought merch would be higher, actually.
yeah, me too. But apparently not.
What about the video game side of things?
Don't
Is there a
have
breakdown
this.
for that specifically?
No.
Because I feel like those, when they launch now, particularly like the latest Spider-Man one, the hype is just unreal. And obviously the ticket price for those is seems to be creeping up and up. Maybe one for us to touch on another teardown, the sort of video game industry side of things.
Yeah, don't have this here. Didn't look up. But yeah, that's it from my side. I don't have any more numbers to share.
There's some bloody big numbers. I think they might be some of the biggest numbers by some way. Not the biggest profit, but profit percentages. But
oh, by the way, one more thing. So I had a look at how much revenue still, like Marvel still produces comic books. So how much basically they grossed in sales. So apparently in 2021, Marvel made $280 million from just comic sales alone.
Wow.
So that's not nothing either, right?
No, that business on its own. I don't know what the profit is in there, but I honestly had no idea that was still as big as it is.
Yeah. But another fun fact: apparently, in 1973, Marvel Comics sold 300% more copies than it did in 2013. So 40 years later.
Well, I guess the technology was all on paper at that point, didn't have the option.
So, should we do a little... so, you remember our last companies that we talked about, right? Mm-hmm. So, how much revenue did you say did Marvel make with comic books? 280 million, right?
Yeah, in 2013.
Okay, does Warby Parker make more or less revenue?
Warby Parker, more. So Warby Parker, I think, made more than Marvel in comic sales.
Tom, what's your take?
Just to be contrarian, I'm going to say less. I can't really remember. I know they're going to be close.
Yeah, they are like in the ballpark of double. So Warby Parker actually makes a little bit more than double of the revenue of only comic books. But another designer's favorite, Monotype, whole company Monotype makes pretty much the same. About 300 million. So we have Marvel's comic book business is the same size as Monotype full business.
If you'd told me, if we out of the context of the discussion about MCU and the cinema world, I would have had the comics being actually way above a single typography business. Even though I don't see it as like a big industry anymore, it still exists. It's Marvel, for God's sake. So I'm actually quite surprised that they're as close as they are in retrospect.
Yeah.
Crazy numbers.
Crazy, as always.
So what a run they're on. It feels like every time a new Marvel film comes out, it just busts new records. It kind of peaked with that. Is it Infinity War? It was one of the like Avengers films, wasn't it? That was like for a period
one. Yeah,
the highest grossing.
The second highest of all time is Avenger. Yeah.
Just nuts. Haven't seen it. Much to a lot of my friends' disdain. But how can they keep this run going? It feels like things have tapered off a little bit. I think that's a good way for us maybe to segue into specifically the threats and opportunities might be for Marvel Studio moving forward. How can they maintain this incredible record? Don't know who'd like to go first, maybe on the sort of threats side of things. For it looks like Alen might be up for that first.
I'm actually giving Franz.
Oh, are you?
A stage.
Any thoughts, Franz?
I think threats is definitely how do people consume content. So that's definitely, if we still have biggest revenue stream box office sales, so actual cinemas, then that's definitely a threat for any company in this business. So will people actually go to the cinema to consume that? Maybe superhero movies are reasons that you go into actual movie because you want to enjoy this masterpiece in with good quality audio and the huge screen, right? So there are some movies that you purposefully go. Like for example, me, the last time I went into movies was Avatar, and I'm not a big movie like visitor. I rarely go to movie theater. So that might be a threat, but also maybe not, because they are still in a type of movie that might bring people to the movie theaters. At the same time, I think that superhero movies are still so special that it's easy to also get bored of this. So superhero fatigue, after hearing that there are 32 movies made by Marvel, I think that's the biggest downside, or that's the biggest threat that people just get bored of this content. And maybe that's what gave them the boost. All of a sudden you would have awesome superhero movies that you could watch, and that would not be the weird movies that you knew from earlier. And now people maybe got fed up. So I would say maybe we have a similar we have a similar situation again as we had the first superhero fatigue in Marvel's history after the World War II. So in the 50s, where people didn't want to see that. Apart from this, no real threats come to mind.
The oversaturation one, and we'll move on to Alen if you've got anything different to that, is interesting. For me, on a creative level, it's concerning, right? Like, I do enjoy cinema, not a superhero person, not massively anti it, but it is a bit foreboding of, like, you know, once you find a formula that works and is a guaranteed money maker, and it just takes over the summer, right? It's happened with Barbie as well. That the creativity in cinema might start waning. Martin Scorsese was very open in saying, like, these aren't really films, it's more like going to a theme park. He's since said those comments were taken out of context. But I do think there's a foreboding to that, and that people may get a little fed up of this. Conversely, though, I think the genius of Marvel and the way they do things is that although the narrative is usually around a superhero, the type of film actually varies quite a bit. So sometimes it's a heist movie, and sometimes it's a thriller, sometimes it's a comedy. So I do feel like they bring a really interesting creative dimension that maybe they can keep reinventing it, and that they are different flavors. You know, Guardians appealed to me because it's more of a comedy. I started watching one of the Captain America ones and didn't really like that kind of thriller aspect so much. So I think they are very clever on that front. And the 32 films in, Franz, you said earlier they've got 500 characters. That's like Pokemon level characters in their back pocket.
They even have more now.
If they want to, it feels like,
I think they are at 800 something. Please, write as a comment how many characters they have. But I think I read something of 800 characters.
Wow. I'm sure a few of them are a little lame maybe, but I didn't really appreciate
plus,
that.
Yeah, I have it in my notes.
So many to fall back on. Alen, anything to add on that point, or any other threats that you think we should be aware of?
No, but I would go into opportunities if I may.
Yeah, sure.
VR, very obvious one. So like experiencing action movie in a VR, high quality VR headset at home could be even a better experience than theater. You can maybe even be interacting with it. So I think that's a huge next wave for Marvel, and a lot of these content character based businesses. And that's why also when we get to buy, sell, hold, I would be on the buying side still, because this has such a huge upside that it's going to revolutionize this whole space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think technology is probably the biggest one, isn't it? And we talked about the maybe cinema becoming less popular for various reasons, affordability being one at the moment. But but obviously they're having to profit share with that. There are additional costs with distribution and marketing and things like that. Whereas if you are owning the platform, Disney Plus, and you are going straight into eyeballs, there's benefits from a markup perspective from going that route. I hope we don't end up completely there, because I do enjoy the shared experience, but that's probably going to be rose-tinted glasses in 20, 30 years. So yeah, technology. One of the opportunities for me is it still feels like there's a lot of interesting potential for crossover. So Disney now, obviously they own 20th Century Fox as well. And I don't know, the kind of Disney thing, you feel like there's some interesting crossovers, maybe in the way they do shorts and series, and even in the video games world, that might be something they can explore, because they keep acquiring interesting IP. And obviously they have managed to reacquire some of the licenses. I think Spider-Man, I don't know if you mentioned this earlier, Franz, that's only recently come out of Sony's ownership, I think, or there's been something happen with that will free up Spider-Man to appear more in the universe. So again, and then new demographics. They obviously were criticised quite heavily back in the day for the lack of diversity in the films, but also the filmmaking. But then we saw things like Black Panther really connecting with people. And it feels like, okay, culturally, maybe there are other angles and other ways that they can reach into other communities and other territories through stuff that resonates with that audience a bit more, which I would think would be great from a storytelling perspective as well, to bring a bit of something new to it. I certainly feel like there's more opportunity than threat as well. So I guess that's interesting segue into the sort of buy, sell, hold. Alen, you've already shown your hand, but do you mind expanding on that a little bit? If
there's nothing more to expand on, it's because just I see, as you said, I see more opportunities than threats, depending on the price, of course. But I just see, let's say, more positive future than not.
Yeah, Franz.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, this is still a creative business, and I think it's about finding a new way how this is going to be exciting again, because it seems that they have passed the threshold of creating another Marvel movie, and that's also gonna be awesome. So I think that's gone, but I trust that with the powerhouse that they have in the back of creating content and what they have already done, I also think that they can overcome that and create a type of movie, or maybe the way of delivering the movie that will be the next level for them and bring them back to to lead this market again, as they already did. So I would also go into buy, also because I think entertainment businesses are businesses that will strive in general.
Agreed. Echo both your points there. Yeah. Not usual caveat, not financial advice, entertainment purposes only in an entertainment focused podcast. I think we're there. I think really interesting. I really enjoy these ones where we go a little more into the entertainment space, a bit like we did with Tour de France. I learned a whole bunch in the process of this, and both of you today. So hopefully we'll shortlist another one at some point.
Yeah, same here. But if you want to learn more, you can check out our mini 7-day MBA, which is a 7-day email course, which you can sign up for on d.mba/mini-mba. And if you sign up for it, you will receive 7 emails over the course of 7 days, each of them teaching you one business concept relevant for designers. And you can start gaining your business confidence as part of your complement to listening to this podcast. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Franz. See you in the next one.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.